Good afternoon, Dr. Hagan. Thank you for doing this pretty interesting midterm exam. My name is Joshua Caldwell, and I'll be going over what we've learned so far this semester. So, what is environmental education? So, a widely used definition for environmental education, or EE, comes from the Belgrade Charter of the UN, United Nations Education, Scientific, Cultural Organization from 1978, and as follows. Environmental education is a process aimed at developing a world population that is aware of and concerned about the total environment and its associated problems, which has the knowledge, skills, attitudes, motivations, and commitment to work individually and collectively towards solutions of current problems and the prevention of new ones. So according to UNESCO, the three goals of environmental education are to foster clear awareness of and concern about economic, social, political, and ecological interdependence in urban and rural areas, to provide every person with opportunities to acquire the knowledge, values, attitudes, commitment, and skills needed to protect and improve the environment, and finally, to create new patterns of behavior of individuals, groups, and societies towards the environment. Due to the democracy and governmental structure of the United States, oftentimes legislation that is passed by one aspect of the government can often be nullified by another before being passed, as is the case with the Clinton presidency, who wanted to renew or continue the Bush administration's EE law, but Congress shot it down. In other instances, the worth of the economy often outweighs environmental legislation, and when legislation is passed for EE, oftentimes the funds are insufficient for such a large nation as ours. So, for example, the Bush administration passed the National Environmental Education Act of 1990, and over a 17-year period had $100 million distributed for the U.S., about $6 million per year. It's not really going to cut for a nation like ours. So, where does EE's history begin in the United States? In the 1800s, concerns about the human interactions with nature started to come about. Emerson wrote an essay called Nature in 1836. And essentially, it began a transcendentalism movement that infused God with nature. The United States seemed limitless in the early 1800s, and they continued to use and abuse the resources of the United States. And a lot of people, like John Muir, started advocating for the preservation of the United States. John Muir co-founded the Sierra Club in 1892, and one man to not just manage land, but let the wilderness manage itself. In the early 1900s, there was a call for sensible resource consumption to be balanced with maintaining habitat quality and leave some wilderness behind to go along with it. Nature study took over a lot of curriculum in the early 1900s, thanks to Anna Botsford Comstock, who was the first female professor at Cornell University. She wrote the Handbook of Nature Study in 1911. Then the Dust Bowl and Great Depression era started, as beginning conservation education as we knew it. Schools started really focused and hampered down on scientific method over the study of nature. Throughout the 1900s, presidents such as FDR, LBJ, and George H.W. Bush were some of the presidents more well known for what they did in environmental education. And of course, we had the book Silent Spring in 1962, written by Rachel Carlson, talking about how we should get rid of certain pesticides and how terrible they are on certain aspects of the environment and ecosystems in general. And then there's, of course, Earth Day, which started on April 22nd, 1970. So marketing movements, I don't know if marketing is the right word, but movements like that should really bring out the idea of environmental education and its importance. Then throughout the 2000s, EE is still discussed even without government funding available. Awareness that outdoor play can increase environmental awareness is becoming quite popular. And the UN is trying to establish the Education for Sustainable Development movement. It was from 2005 to 2015, and its goal was to enhance the role for promoting sustainable living and development for the entire globe. So environmental problems are difficult to understand, and demographics, such as baby boomers retiring, minorities growing in number. In the US, there's more scheduled family time than free time, as well as children being more exposed to TV, tablets, and movies, and so on. Interactions with more common aspects of nature, such as wildlife, are seen as rare occurrences, and the media is their primary form of gathering information about the environment. There's also the psychology of despair, where we always think that we're being taught that there's so much negativity going on. Some individuals may think, well, how can I fix that? There's too much to fix, I can't do it. And finally, there's funding to enhance environmental education, as well as enhancing environmental change, are all issues that EE faces, at least that's the case in the United States. So some important ideology worth note in regards to EE includes behavioral change, which is by far the most important issue with EE that needs to be addressed. Issues about sustainable futures, there's trying to minimize global footprints. Developing third world countries and island nations is becoming a priority as well. And so is renewable energy and trying to annihilate poverty, living in peace, and increasing everyone's pleasure in life. But in order to facilitate changed behaviors, first we must consider what environmental literacy is. It is simply someone who works individually and within a network of people who make informed decisions concerning the environment and is willing to act on those decisions for the sake of improving the local, regional, and global environment or community through working within civic life. These individuals possess knowledge, dispositions, competencies, and understanding on a wide range of topics, issues, problems, and contain a distinct set of cognitive skills and problem-solving mechanisms that result in environmentally responsible behaviors. So some of these things, critical thinking, critical reading, all super important for creating what we want as environmental literacy. But in order to distill this literacy, an EE educator must have a few common competencies to be effective at forming these proper perspectives. They need to have a well-rounded or working knowledge, at the minimum, of the material they are teaching to their specific audience. That should be pretty obvious, I think. And combine higher level thinking skills. So a lot of that knowledge comes from subject matters such as science, math, politics, history, and so on. I've added a table here that lists out some of the competencies that teachers must have a minimum understanding of in order to teach environmental education. In order for one to be able to understand something such as environmental education, they also need to be able to create a cognitive map where they can retrieve, add, and draw information from. The learning process starts from the time they are born, and there are aspects such as sensory perception, which is essential in how our senses are able to experience something through sight, hearing, touch, and so on. And it's considered short-term memory. The more you use short-term memory, the easier it will be for you to get that information. You can find something in your long-term memory and reposition it to short-term memory to learn and remember things and expand your knowledge. These experiences can help you learn a lot. This lecture is likely the reason why this midterm is me giving you a presentation rather than just a multiple choice or written exam format. Or at least that's my thought process, considering Edgar Dale's cone of experience, where you will remember 90% of what you do and 70% of what you say and write. So I think it's pretty cool that we're doing this. A few other methods in which we can increase our ability to learn is through through thinking, which builds and rebuilds mental structures. It's kind of like learning math from the table we discussed earlier. Creating mental models, surrounding social life with individuals and media outside of work through social context learning, and creating a mental and physical environment conducive to learning. Now, there are multiple theories out there regarding how individuals learn. Here's a list of 10 theories that I put together for you. There's Piaget's cognitive development. Sorry if I butchered his name. I'm not really sure how to pronounce it. There's experiential learning, inquiry learning, social learning, cooperative learning, Bloom's taxonomy of cognitive domain, critical thinking, inquiry learning, systems thinking, and finally comprehensive thinking. I've also attached a basic definition to each of those, as well as the source that I drew them from. Sometimes the learning aspect of EE is met, but oftentimes the behavior aspect that I mentioned previously remains unchanged. This can occur for a number of reasons, such as a psychology of despair that I talked about earlier, just a lack of motivation, perhaps self-efficacy isn't where it should be, maybe it's a little negative, the diffusion of innovation, so perhaps there's no leader around to initiate a change, and then of course, potentially negative feedback loops. Behavioral changes can be implemented through, though, as research has come up with multiple methods to enable these changes. Here I've listed out 9 types of behavioral learning theories, which are the theory of planned behavior, elaboration likelihood model of persuasion, diffusion of innovation, which I just mentioned, that's supposed to be self-efficacy, self-determination theory, flow of behavior change, reasonable personal model, value belief norm model, and finally environmental citizenship behavior model. And for each of those, I've also attached a simple definition. Learning isn't always done in the classroom though, as it sometimes comes in the form of social media and marketing. Social context learning, which I vaguely touched upon a few minutes ago, is learning outside of the workplace and often heavily influenced by the individuals one surrounds himself with. The more people think, the more likely that an idea or attitude will affect their attitudes, norms, and beliefs. People like knowing that they make a difference, and telling them that their combined actions lead up to something positive is always a good thing. Sharing support with one another or a positive feedback. And then social marketing, which uses prompts or incentives to remind people and provide background information. So Dr. Hagen, as we discussed earlier this semester, the behavioral changes that I'm implementing at my household involve conserving water during showers. Through 2.5 weeks of this process, my wife and I are meeting our goal of limiting shower time to 9 minutes or less. And so far, we have 41 to 54% water savings compared to if we were to take a 12-minute shower every day. And here's a chart that I created which demonstrates how much water can be used by someone or the US if they were to shower 9 or 12 minutes every day, week, month, and throughout the year. So we've gone over what environmental education is, but what exactly is environmental advocacy? So just to touch on briefly, environmental education is a process of inquiry and critical thinking. Advocacy, on the other hand, means to essentially support the thoughts, actions, or various causes of something. For environmental education is about fostering one's own audience, the ability to think and not what to think. It's not about preaching or indoctrinating something, but allowing your audience to come up with their own thought processes. Sometimes, though, biases come into play with even the best educators, I imagine. And it is up to the educator in environmental education to create a non-biased atmosphere to be diligent advocates. So invisible bias is when beliefs and or assumptions are embedded into activities, programs, and advertisements that they are nearly invisible to observers or hidden messages, essentially. An example of this could be a student writes an essay for school about an all-encompassing insurance program for everyone in the United States. This could be health insurance, for example. The student writes his or her essay with resources from only one side of a political spectrum without realizing that there are multiple perspectives associated with this insurance for all program he or she is writing about. It could be writing about certain aspects from the right, from the left, somewhere in between, and they don't even realize that they're being biased in their own paper. Can funders create bias? Absolutely. You can have organizations like PepsiCo, who own Gatorade market. They want school teachers to talk about promoting Gatorade to their athletes. Teachers are therefore marketing for PepsiCo, or the Pepsi company, I guess. So here's a list of a few bias types, as well as their definitions. You can have confirmation bias, gambler's fallacy, post-purchase rationalization, observational selection bias, negative bias, bandwagon effect, projection bias, current moment bias, anchoring bias, and finally in-group bias. I encourage you, if you like to read the definitions, to take a moment and pause this to read over them real quick. But biases aren't the only obstacle that educators need to be aware of when instructing their audiences. They also need to be aware of self-validating reduction. So this is where a self-fulfilling prophecy, in which one of the main effects of the prophecy at hand is to reduce someone or something in the world, such as a stereotype, or with negative feedback loops. An example of this that I thought of comes from just my military background and how people hate to train for PT test, physical training tests. Some people. A lot of people like to work out in the military, but an example is I'm terrible at running. There's no way I'm going to pass my fitness test next week. So, the soldier, airman, sailor, whoever they may be, doesn't train and ends up failing his or her run test and confirms this negative thought process or prophecy. Sometimes students simply need to gain a different perspective of the issues they are facing. They can be accomplished through a few different techniques, such as reframing the problem. This is where you can look at a problem from a different angle, find alternative solutions, act out those solutions and see if it corrects the real problem. They could do this through the use of, maybe they want to use a friend or a colleague who comes from a different culture or language, or doesn't even have to be from anything different like that. It just be a new set of eyes to tell the perspective. So in the case of culture and language, this could be considered multiculturalism. They can also use multiple perspectives, how people of different demographics or resource users want to use something. Will there be a conflict of interest between these two groups? Something you can think about. Then you can make invisible values more visible. You could reimagine the future. If you step back from always think about X, let's just say economics, what are the pros and cons if you do Y or Z for this situation? And finally, you can think about any assumptions you have about an issue or problem. Is there a way to not think about them or go forward without bias? So one of the activities we did earlier this semester involved the students creating bibliographies of environmental educators that they either know of or wanted to learn more about. Here I've listed out 5 different educators, as well as their birth year, birthplace, post-secondary education, and some of their contributions toward environmental education. I wasn't able to fill out all these slots. I simply just watched all the mini lectures that they all gave and wasn't able to gather all the information. But Joy O'Keefe, who is a scientist and she studies white nose syndrome in bats, spent a lot of time working with ecology and wind turbines, looking at the pros and cons of that entire relationship. Jane Goodall, as I'm sure most people, at least in the United States, maybe the world, have heard of or know of. What I thought was interesting about her, she got her PhD from Oxford without ever having an undergraduate degree. I think that's very fascinating. Of course, we all know about a lot of things that she's done with chimpanzees, discovering there's language, they use tools, they eat meat, and so on. What I didn't know about her was that she's a UN Ambassador of Peace. And I think I knew that she was named to Time Magazine's one of the 100 most influential people in the world. There's Alexander von Humboldt, who's from Germany. And I really like this presentation because the girl who was talking about it was very strongly adamant about introducing the world to him, which is really cool. I didn't even know anything about him. And then there's I think her name was Stacia Hendricks, who's a naturalist along the Georgia Gulf Coast. And finally, Paul Hart, who does a tremendous amount of environmental education for Canada, as well as the United Nations and multiple nations across the world. It's pretty cool to watch all those bibliographies. So once this course comes in, and there are 5 really good methods for educators to stay up to date with their EE curriculum and goals. And these methods can include, but aren't limited to research, continued learning, so staying up to date, finding a mentor, real world experiences, and obviously reflection and peer coaching. Finally, I'd like to thank Dr. Hagen and my classmates for providing me the information used in this presentation. Although I tried to reword some of the information in this presentation, there was no way I could reword it all. Thanks for listening, and I'll be chatting with you later.